Hey guys, tonight we're slipping through the creaky wooden doors of a world where birth wasn't a sanitized hospital event but a candlelit, high-stakes gamble played out on straw mattresses and stone floors. You're entering the medieval birthing chamber, yes, the actual room, hidden behind castle walls, buzzing with whispered prayers, herbs smoldering in the corner, and the constant urgency of a life about to begin. This isn't your average knight in shining armor fairy tale. This is blood, sweat, linen soaked in who knows what, and a midwife with more pressure on her shoulders than the castle's stone arches. You're crouching in the shadows as the lady of the manor moans through labor. The midwife, probably older, with hands worn like river stones, moves with practiced calm. No gloves. No epidurals. Just years of intuition, a pouch full of remedies, and the kind of stare that can quiet a screaming noblewoman. And here's your first reality check: you probably wouldn't survive this birth, especially if you were the one in labor. But that midwife, she just might save the day. Again. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You glance around the chamber, no doctors here. The physician isn't welcome. This is women's territory. The midwife is in charge, flanked by female attendants called gossips. No, really, that's what they were called. These women serve as extra hands, support crew, and emotional anchors. There's often a priest nearby, yes, but only called if things go wrong, like really wrong. Otherwise, it's just the midwife running the show with terrifying efficiency. She's summoned at all hours, sometimes by a frantic servant bursting into her cottage at midnight, other times with a dignified summons sealed with wax and worry. Either way, she arrives quickly, carrying a leather bag full of herbs, blessed objects, maybe even a knife. Not for surgery. For the umbilical cord. The lady in labor is propped up, not laid down like in modern births, because upright positions were thought to help gravity do its job. Smart. There's a birthing stool in some castles, a low, wooden thing with a hole in the middle and handles to grip. Picture a medieval toilet but with more screaming and less privacy. There's chanting. There's boiling water. There's a strong smell of lavender, or maybe rue or mugwort, if the midwife is trying to fend off evil spirits or bad luck. Because that's her job too, protect the soul, not just the body. The midwife walks the line between the physical and the spiritual. She knows her Latin prayers and her local legends. She might murmur a blessing over the birth canal. She might draw a cross in chalk on the door. If the baby is slow to cry, she baptizes it on the spot, just a splash of water and a prayer, so the soul won't wander unbaptized into limbo. That's not drama. That's doctrine. And if the baby doesn't make it, well, you don't speak of that. Not here. Not yet. You just fold the linen and carry on. There will be time for mourning later, if you're lucky. But here's a quirky twist: in royal and noble births, the midwife was sometimes watched, judged, even interrogated afterward. Why? Because that baby represented power, inheritance, sometimes even a kingdom. If something went wrong, if the child was deformed, stillborn, or suspiciously dark-haired in a family of redheads, blame could land squarely on the midwife. And if she had a mole, a birthmark, or the wrong accent? Whispered rumors of witchcraft weren't far behind. Historians still argue whether midwives were genuinely respected or quietly feared. Probably both. Probably depending on the outcome. Yet, they were indispensable. The queen might have the crown, but the midwife held the cradle. Every noble family owed its future to the skill of a woman they'd never let dine at their table. And that's the weird magic of it. These midwives weren't servants. They weren't quite professionals either. They were something else entirely, sacred, necessary, and utterly forgettable once the child's first cry rang out and the danger passed. So there you are, standing by the hearth, watching a midwife clean her tools while servants coo over the swaddled newborn. No applause. No fanfare. She's already packing up, ready for her next quiet battle in the name of life. She might get a coin. She might get a nod. She rarely gets written down. But tonight, she gets remembered. The air is different out here, cooler, rougher, and filled with the scent of damp earth and hearth smoke. You're no longer behind castle walls. You're crouched in the cramped doorway of a thatched roof cottage in a medieval village. It's night time, again, because babies seem to have an impeccable sense of timing. Inside, a woman screams through labor on a straw-stuffed pallet, while a midwife works by flickering candlelight, muttering to herself and occasionally to God, though the two are often interchangeable at this hour. This isn't a royal birth. There's no priest on standby, no anxious noble pacing the halls. Just chickens clucking outside and a nervous husband holding a bucket like it might help. It won't. But at least he's out of the way. This is where the real, raw, and overlooked miracle of birth unfolds, and the midwife here? She's not wearing fine linen or a polished reputation. She's in a stained woolen dress, hair tied back, sleeves rolled up, and hands steady as stone. Her name might be Agnes or Maud or something that's been lost to time, scribbled once on a parish record and then swallowed by the centuries. But in this moment, she's the only one keeping terror from taking over the room. The expectant mother is young, exhausted, her face slick with sweat, her eyes wide with pain and panic. She's had no prenatal vitamins, no ultrasounds, and certainly no breathing exercises. Just bread, prayer, and the belief that this is her lot in life. The midwife gently wipes her brow with a cloth steeped in lavender water. Not to soothe her exactly, though that's a nice bonus, but to drive off evil spirits that might linger near during birth. Superstition and care are tangled together here, indistinguishable from each other. In her satchel, the midwife carries a collection of objects that would make a modern OBGYN either laugh or scream. A dried snake's skin. A rabbit's foot. A wax figurine of Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth, famous for being swallowed by a dragon and bursting out of its belly unharmed. You'd want her on your side, too. There's also a knife, not for anything surgical, heaven forbid, but for symbolic protection. Laying cold iron under the bed was believed to ward off fairies who might steal the newborn and leave a changeling in its place. That's not paranoia. That's prevention. The tools of the trade are basic but time-tested. A clean cloth if available. A sturdy pair of hands. A strong back. Some boiled water, not for sterilization, which wasn't a thing yet, but to soften cloths or warm a chilled newborn. And her voice, low and steady, telling the laboring woman she can do this, that the pain will pass, that God is watching. And here's the thing, these women believed her. Because midwives had seen more births than most priests had seen funerals. They weren't guessing. They were surviving. Now and then, she glances at the mother's belly, assessing the timing not with a monitor but by sound, by silence, by how the woman clutches the edge of the bedding. She might whisper a charm, or murmur a line from a psalm. Some midwives used psalters, holy books that doubled as both spiritual comfort and medical tool, because if the holy words rested on your belly during labor, surely God would take notice. Outside, neighbors might hover, ears pressed to walls, praying or gossiping or both. Inside, time slows. Then quickens. A push. A scream. A silence so sharp it slices the air. And then, a cry. The midwife's hands move fast, cradling, wiping, lifting the baby to the mother's chest. She checks for breath, for color, for life. If the newborn is weak, she might rub the feet with salt, or breathe into its mouth. If it doesn't cry, she might dip it in wine. And if it still doesn't stir, she makes the call only she can make, an emergency baptism. A few drops of water. A quiet incantation. Because in this world, an unbaptized soul is a tragedy that lingers long after the body is gone. And if the mother's bleeding doesn't stop, the midwife digs into her kit again. She might bind the belly tight with linen soaked in vinegar. She might apply pressure with her own hands, whispering Hail Marys between gritted teeth. She might send someone sprinting to fetch a priest, but not because she's giving up. Because she's covering all the bases. Eventually, the danger passes. Or it doesn't. The newborn wails, or doesn't. The fire burns low, and the midwife's work moves on. She checks the afterbirth, inspects it with the expertise of someone who's learned the hard way what normal looks like. She might bury it in the yard, or burn it, depending on the local customs. Some believed the placenta must be properly buried to protect the child's soul. Others thought it held magic, good or bad, and needed guarding. Meanwhile, she wraps the baby in swaddling cloth. Tight. Like a little mummy, to keep its limbs straight and its fate even straighter. The mother sleeps, or at least tries. The midwife, weary but composed, might accept a bowl of broth or a piece of bread. Or she might decline, slip out the door, and vanish into the mist before the rooster crows. You step outside and watch her go. No applause. No thanks carved into history. But someone's alive who wouldn't be without her. You're following her now, the midwife, down a rutted lane lined with low cottages and the occasional curious pig. The stars above are sharp and cold, and the mud squishes under your boots. No sidewalks in this part of town. She doesn't walk like someone important. She doesn't wear robes or rings. But don't be fooled. In her little leather pouch swings a lifetime of knowledge, half learned from women long gone, half from bitter, hard-won experience. What she knows can save you. Or if you're unlucky, save your baby while you don't make it. The contents of that pouch. A medieval midwife's toolkit was part pharmacy, part charm box, part portable chapel. And you're about to open it. First, the herbs. Oh, the herbs. She's got dried bundles of everything from pennyroyal to rue, angelica to artemisia. Some help induce labor. Some soothe pain. Others are meant to protect against demons. A few do all three, or at least claim to. Take mugwort, it's bitter, powerful, and wrapped in enough folklore to qualify as the Swiss Army knife of medieval childbirth. Crushed into tea, it might help start contractions. Tucked under a pillow, it might keep the devil away. Double bonus. Then there's Dittany of Crete. Rare. Expensive. Believed to help expel the placenta. That's if you could get your hands on it, which often required some serious bartering or a friend in a monastery garden. Juniper berries, garlic cloves, and powdered toadstool. Yep, those too. Not everything in her bag is pleasant or safe by modern standards. But when death hovers in every shadow, you reach for what you have, not what you wish you had. But the pouch holds more than plants. There's a crucifix, small and smooth from years of touch. A vial of holy water from the parish font. A scrap of parchment with a protective psalm written in looping Latin script. These are spiritual tools. Wielded not with superstition, but with conviction. Because when a laboring woman begins to bleed out, and prayers mix with screams, you need more than herbs. You need hope. She also carries stones, yes, literal stones. Smooth, round, and believed to aid fertility or ease labor pains when gripped in the hand. One of them might be from a river near Glastonbury, believed to be touched by saints. Or from some druidic ruin up north, whispered to have powers even before Rome marched in and made things weird. But perhaps the most underrated item? Chicken fat. Don't laugh. It's used as a base for poultices, rubbed on the belly, or even applied with herbs to help a breech baby turn. It's slippery, it's warm, and in a world without petroleum jelly, it's kind of a miracle. That, or it just makes everything smell like soup. Either way, it's in the bag. And here's your fringe fact of the evening: some midwives wore amulets made from wolf teeth. Why? Because wolves were seen as fiercely protective of their young, and it was thought their power might rub off on the laboring mother. Historians still argue whether these were symbolic gestures or actual beliefs, but really, at 3 a.m. in a freezing hut, no one's asking for footnotes. Some midwives also kept small icons or relics sewn into their clothes. A bit of a saint's bone, a chip of wood said to be from the true cross, or a dried fig that had once been blessed during a pilgrimage. Not everything in that toolkit could be explained. Some of it just felt right. When your job is to usher life into a world full of famine, war, and disease, you pack whatever might tip the odds. And if you're wondering, yes, she cleans her tools. Just not the way you're thinking. Boiling water, sun drying, or rubbing with vinegar are all standard. Is it sterile? Not by modern standards. But it's careful, and in a world where death hangs out like it's on retainer, careful is pretty heroic. When she's not delivering babies, the midwife often serves as a local healer too. She's the one people visit when they've got a fever, a boil, a strange ache they won't talk about in public. She's the one with the poultice for a sprain, the tea for bad dreams, the charm for a colicky child. She doesn't charge much. Maybe an egg, a bit of wool, a handful of coins if the family has it. Sometimes she gets nothing but a nod and a loaf of bread, but she keeps going anyway. Because she's not just delivering babies. She's holding the line between chaos and continuity. Every birth she attends is another thread in the fragile web of the village. Every time she saves a mother, she saves a household. And every time she loses one, well, she still has to walk home through the dark, heavy with the weight of it. And so, her pouch swings by her side again, lighter now, but always ready. She doesn't have a license. She doesn't need one. Her authority comes from blood and breath and the murmured thanks of 100 mothers who lived to hold their babies. And that, dear listener, is better than any parchment seal or priestly blessing. The sun creeps over the horizon, but she's already awake. The midwife, hands scrubbed raw from last night's birth, is sorting herbs in the low light of her cottage. There's no classroom, no textbook, no lectures from a learned master with chalk and robes. In the medieval world, there is no such thing as a formal medical school for women. And yet, she knows more about childbirth than half the men scribbling notes at the university in Salerno. Welcome to the world of learning without lectures, where a midwife's training is passed hand to hand, whisper to whisper. Your first lesson? You don't learn midwifery from a book, you learn it from blood. From watching, helping, and, eventually, doing. Most midwives began their training as young girls, apprentices to older, experienced women. Not always family. Sometimes just the one who happened to live nearby. You'd carry water, clean cloths, hold a lantern during night labors, and most importantly, observe. You'd learn to read the signs of a baby about to crown. You'd learn what a good cry sounds like, and what silence means. And you'd see death. Sooner than you'd expect. It was an oral tradition, built on repetition, instinct, and a terrifying degree of responsibility. No diplomas. No safety net. Just the confidence that, when the time came, you would remember what to do, and do it fast. The older midwives would test you. Not with quizzes, but with glances. Did you notice the mother's pallor? Could you hear when her breath changed from strained to panicked? Did you know when to speak and when to be silent? Passing meant one thing, they started letting you catch the baby. Midwives didn't operate in isolation. They often worked in pairs, or with a small team of gossips, the original term for birth attendants and female companions. These women weren't just idle chatterboxes. They were the emotional backbone of the birthing process, offering prayers, stories, encouragement, and occasionally strong hands to hold the mother steady. And those skills? They didn't stay the same across Europe. Midwives in Paris learned different techniques than those in the Scottish Highlands. A German midwife might swear by mustard poultices, while her Spanish counterpart reached for saffron and cinnamon. This patchwork of knowledge wasn't a flaw. It was the strength of the system, localized, practical, and deeply rooted in the unique needs of each community. But despite their experience and importance, midwives weren't considered professionals in the way male doctors were starting to be. Those men, most of whom had never attended a single birth, were beginning to earn credentials from universities, writing in Latin, quoting Galen and Hippocrates, and being taken very seriously, despite not knowing where the placenta attaches. The midwives. They were called when it mattered. But they were rarely praised, rarely promoted, and never admitted to the learned guilds. You could deliver 100 babies without losing one and still be treated as a rustic servant with some useful skills. And heaven help you if one baby died. Suddenly, the whispers started. Was she careless? Cursed? Or worse, dabbling in dark arts? Still, the midwives taught one another. They wrote letters, when they could. They memorized chants and remedies and tucked them into the folds of their memory like holy verses. Some even kept books of secrets, personal collections of cures and rituals, written in the margins of religious texts or tucked between pages of psalters. These were their grimoires, though no one dared call them that aloud. Here's a quirky twist: in a few rare cases, midwives did try to publish their knowledge. One famous example is Trocula of Salerno, a woman, or possibly a collective pen name, whose medical writings on women's health survived through the centuries. Her texts offered practical, respectful advice on childbirth, menstruation, and even cosmetics. But even today, historians argue whether Trocula was real, or whether a male physician stole her words and slapped his name on the spine. Because that's the truth of medieval education, women's knowledge was vital, and yet it was constantly vulnerable to being overwritten. If you were a woman and wrote a book, chances were someone would claim it for himself, declare it heretical, or just ignore it into oblivion. So the midwives kept teaching each other. In kitchens, at bedside vigils, in gardens where the herbs grew strong and secrets could be whispered into the wind. They trained with their hands and remembered with their hearts. And while the universities churned out learned men with dusty scrolls and clean fingernails, midwives stood in doorways, sleeves rolled up, ready to catch the next generation as it entered the world. And here's the kicker: despite the lack of formal education, the survival rates in communities with experienced midwives were often better than those attended by less skilled physicians. That's not magic. That's muscle memory, emotional intelligence, and a stubborn refusal to let go. So when you picture medieval education, don't stop at the cathedral schools or the robed professors. Picture her, too, the midwife crouched in the half-light, whispering to a girl barely old enough to carry firewood, "This is how you hold a life." It starts quietly, as most power shifts do. A new face in the village. A man, dressed in dark robes, carrying a bag that looks suspiciously similar to the midwife's, but heavier with parchment than poultices. He's a physician, trained at the university, and he doesn't deliver babies. Not yet. Not unless something goes wrong. But he's watching, listening, writing things down. You're standing near the edge of the square, watching as the midwife approaches him with cautious curiosity. She's older, wise, seasoned by 3 decades of midnight labor calls and infant cries. He's younger, smells faintly of ink, and speaks in Latin even when nobody asks him to. There's a tension here. Because while she holds the trust of the community, he holds the ear of the authorities. And their worlds are about to collide. In medieval Europe, childbirth was, for centuries, women's business. Midwives ruled this space, not just because they were women, but because they had practical, lived experience. They knew the smell of labor before it began. They knew when to call for extra help, and when to send the father outside so he didn't faint. They didn't just deliver babies. They managed chaos. But around the 13th and 14th centuries, as universities expanded and medical science became increasingly codified, male physicians began poking their noses into the birthing room. Figuratively at first. Then literally. At first, they claimed they were only interested in abnormal births, complicated labors, breech positions, or stillbirths. And sure, that sounds noble. But it also set the stage for a creeping takeover. The medical texts of the time, written mostly by men, began to reflect this shift. They cast midwives as useful but limited, passionate but unlearned, occasionally even dangerous. Never mind that most of these male authors had never attended a single birth. Their authority came not from blooded hands but from book learning and church approval. And here's where it gets messy. When a baby died, who got blamed? Increasingly, the midwife. She must have made a mistake. Or worse, she must have used magic. That term, magic, became the scalpel used to divide the rational male physician from the superstitious female healer. Even if both used similar herbs and prayers, only one was considered respectable. The other, suspect. One of the flashpoints was the use of charms. Midwives had always combined spiritual and practical care. They might recite a psalm, wear a saint's medal, or place iron under the bed. These were old customs, deeply woven into the cultural fabric. But to the educated physician, this was heresy adjacent. And in an era where the Inquisition was revving up, adjacent was dangerous enough. Historians still argue whether the rise of male physicians was a natural evolution of medical knowledge or a hostile takeover. Likely, it was both. On one hand, anatomy studies and university networks did expand the scope of what could be treated. On the other hand, these same institutions often excluded or erased the contributions of women entirely. And when licensing laws were introduced, guess who wrote them? Not the midwives. So here's your quirky tidbit for the night. In some towns, midwives were required to swear oaths not to use sorcery, not to baptize babies unless necessary, not to consult with other wise women outside the church's guidance. And who administered these oaths? Often the very physicians who saw them as competition. That's like your rival gym teacher grading your final exam. Back in our village, the dynamic shifts. When a noble's wife goes into labor and something goes wrong, it's the midwife who's blamed, even though she's the one who saved the baby. The physician shows up after the fact, examines the situation, and writes a report. It's sanitized. It's official. It's wrong. But it becomes the record. And yet, midwives continue. They can't stop. Too many women depend on them. The physician might make a show of learning, but he doesn't come to the door at midnight. He doesn't sit through a 12-hour labor in a smoky cottage. He doesn't know the woman's name, or that this is her 5th child, and the last one nearly didn't make it. Still, the pressure mounts. In cities especially, male midwives begin to appear. They call themselves accoucheurs, fancy French for man who helps at birth. It's rare, but growing. And the midwives are pushed further to the margins. In some regions, they're required to report to physicians. In others, they're banned from practicing unless they register with local authorities, a process that conveniently requires approval from male doctors. You look at the midwife now, a little older, a little wearier. She still works. Still delivers. Still whispers blessings over tiny heads and ties knots with shaking fingers. But the world around her is changing. Authority is shifting. And the knowledge she carries, soaked in generations of trial and error, is starting to be seen not as wisdom, but as folklore. She knows what's happening. She sees it in the way people look past her when a man in robes enters the room. She feels it in the paperwork, the questions, the accusations dressed up as curiosity. And yet she carries on. Because birth doesn't wait for politics. And mothers don't care about degrees when their world is splitting open with pain. So the next time someone tells you history is just kings and wars and battles, remember her. The midwife. Standing in the shadow of a rising medical empire, holding her ground with nothing but a cloth, a prayer, and hands that never stop moving. You're at the edge of town now, in a small chapel with stone floors so cold your breath fogs the air. A midwife kneels before a local bishop, hands clasped, face set. This isn't prayer. This is paperwork, the medieval kind. She's here for something rare and, in her eyes, slightly insulting, an official license to do the work she's already done for 30 years. Welcome to the world of licensing the wise woman, where spiritual oversight, political control, and bureaucratic theatre collide in a dance of parchment and patriarchy. Until now, the midwife has worked by reputation alone. Her degree is the whispered approval of dozens of mothers and the fact that her hands are known, trusted, and blessed by familiarity. But now she needs permission. The church, increasingly uneasy about midwives' spiritual power, decided it was time to bring them into the fold, on its own terms, of course. In some parts of Europe, especially from the late Middle Ages onward, midwives were required to be licensed by religious or civic authorities. Why? Ostensibly to ensure safety and uniformity. Realistically, to control who got to wield power at the hinge point between life and death. The licensing process varied wildly by region. In some cities, a midwife had to appear before a local bishop or magistrate, swear an oath of good conduct, and promise not to use magic, charms, or unauthorized sacraments. She had to agree never to perform abortions, never to hide a birth, and, this one's important, never to baptize a baby unless it was truly an emergency. Here's the twist. Midwives were often the only people present at a birth. If a child was born blue, unbreathing, and the priest hadn't arrived yet, which was common, because, horses, the midwife had to act. Baptize the baby. Save its soul. But doing so without proper approval? Risky. Too often, midwives were caught in a theological tug-of-war, tasked with saving souls but forbidden from doing so unless the church said it was okay. Some licensing ceremonies got oddly theatrical. The midwife might have to read aloud a set of oaths, place her hand on a relic, or answer questions about her faith. She'd be asked whether she believed in the virgin birth, whether she could recite the Lord's Prayer and the Apostles' Creed, and whether she understood that her first loyalty was to the church, not to the family. Never mind the fact that in most births, the church wasn't even in the room. One fringe detail? In Spain, licensed midwives in some regions were given little medallions or slips of parchment to carry with them, like medieval badges of honor. Not that they prevented trouble. Many midwives still faced accusations of heresy if anything went wrong. It was like being handed a shield made of rice paper and told to fight off a bear. You may be wondering, why did midwives go along with this? Why not just keep doing what they were already doing? The answer is simple: protection. A license didn't guarantee safety, but it helped. It showed the town, the church, and any suspicious neighbors that the midwife was, at least officially, on the right side of things. It was also a form of dignity, an acknowledgement, however begrudging, that her work mattered. And yet, the licenses were double-edged swords. They gave midwives visibility, which also made them easier targets. If someone died in childbirth, an unfortunately common event in an era of zero antibiotics and plentiful plagues, the midwife could be questioned. If she had a license, she might be spared. If not, she might be accused of negligence, malpractice, or worse, witchcraft. Historians still debate how widespread licensing was. In some parts of Italy, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, it became standard practice. In rural England or isolated mountain communities, it remained a rare formality, more rumor than requirement. Some midwives, especially those in Jewish or Muslim communities, created their own standards, rituals and rules passed through generations, independent of the church. And here's the cheeky irony: the very institution that licensed midwives also feared them. They feared their autonomy, their popularity, and their uncanny knack for keeping secrets. Because in the dark hours of birth, women told their midwives everything: fears, confessions, even suspicions about who the real father might be. That kind of knowledge was power. And power, especially in the hands of an unordained woman, made the church sweat a little. But the midwives kept coming. They stood in chapels, took their oaths, signed their names, if they could write, or made an X with dignity. Some rolled their eyes inwardly. Others took it to heart. Either way, they walked out with a slip of paper and a little more armor against a world that praised them quietly and blamed them loudly. And back in the village, nothing really changed. The laboring woman still screamed. The baby still came. The midwife still pressed her hands to a heaving belly and whispered words older than any book. But now, she had something in her pocket, a fragile layer of legitimacy, written in ink and sealed with wax. It wouldn't stop death. But maybe, just maybe, it would stop a trial. You're sitting in a wooden pew now, somewhere between incense and suspicion, as the church bells echo through the village. The midwife kneels not far off, eyes closed, murmuring a prayer, though whether it's for her own soul or someone else's, it's hard to say. You might assume she's welcome here, a familiar face in this house of worship. And in some ways, she is. But the relationship between the medieval church and the midwife? Complicated. Like exes who still share a mailbox. On the surface, the church supported midwives. Birth was sacred. It was one of the key thresholds of life, along with baptism, marriage, and death, that the church claimed jurisdiction over. And who was always present at that threshold? The midwife. So she was tolerated, even needed. She helped bring souls into the world, often with the urgency of someone who understood that eternity might start in the next heartbeat. If a newborn failed to cry, she might splash a little holy water, say the words, and buy that child a ticket into heaven. But, and here's where things twist, the church didn't entirely trust her. Because the midwife operated in private spaces, often at night, surrounded by only women, and sometimes using herbs, charms, or whispered rites that looked suspiciously like spells if you squinted the wrong way. And you'd better believe people squinted. Midwives weren't ordained. They weren't trained in Latin or licensed to perform sacraments. But they did them anyway. Especially baptism, when time ran out and the priest was late, or worse, sleeping. In such cases, canon law eventually granted midwives a kind of emergency sacramental authority. They could baptize if the child's life was clearly in danger. That's a huge concession, when you think about it. An unordained woman, granted temporary control over a soul's fate. No wonder the church was nervous. And so came the rules. Midwives were often required to swear oaths to the church, promising not to perform baptisms unless absolutely necessary, and only using formulaic words, no local dialects, no flourishes, no mumbo-jumbo. They were warned not to encourage any unorthodox beliefs about childbirth or the afterlife. And in some cases, church officials even interrogated midwives after a birth, asking whether they had spoken any unauthorized words, used unblessed water, or baptized without permission. One particularly absurd rule: in some parishes, midwives had to agree never to tie knots during a birth. The church believed that knotted cords or belts might magically tie up the womb and delay labor. Which, in case you missed it, is a theological argument about shoelaces. Historians still argue whether this was an actual concern or just symbolic paranoia. Either way, midwives often kept cords out of sight, just in case someone noticed and got ideas. The contradictions run deep. Midwives were respected for their care, yet accused of overstepping. They were praised when births went well, blamed when they didn't. Some priests welcomed their help, recognizing their experience. Others saw them as loose cannons with holy water and no accountability. And the women themselves? They learned to tread carefully, to baptize quietly, to whisper instead of shout. It wasn't just about the babies. The church also wanted to control the narrative around conception, pregnancy, and women's bodies in general. Midwives, with their herbal knowledge and practical wisdom, often contradicted the church's official stance, sometimes just by existing. For instance, the church viewed menstruation as impure. Midwives treated it as part of a cycle they saw daily. The church condemned abortion as murder. Midwives, in certain cases, knew how to induce it, though they'd never say so out loud. That knowledge, passed in whispers, could save a desperate woman. It could also get a midwife burned. And yet, despite all the suspicion, midwives were often deeply religious. Many were devout, attended Mass, and saw their work as a calling. Some kept crosses in their birthing rooms. Some led group prayers during labor. They didn't see a contradiction between faith and folk practice, because to them, both were rooted in survival and hope. You glance again at the midwife beside you. Her hands are still folded like parchment. But they've caught more babies than the priest has baptized. They felt the slippery heat of new life and the cold stillness of death. They've been lifted in prayer and accused of heresy. And they're still here. Because in the end, the church needed her. Maybe not publicly. Maybe not comfortably. But when the screams started and the candles were lit, no one called for a bishop. They called for her. You're in a smoky kitchen now, the fire's low but still warm, and the air smells faintly of rosemary and worry. A woman has just given birth, and the midwife is cleaning up, quietly folding blood-stained linens and tucking them into a basket to be burned or boiled. The mother rests, exhausted but alive, the newborn swaddled beside her, breathing barely. And then the whispers start. Not out loud, of course. Not at first. But they curl under doors and between floorboards, traveling like smoke. The baby's too small. It doesn't look like the father. That midwife came late. She said a strange prayer. This is where the line between sainthood and suspicion thins to a thread. Because in medieval Europe, when birth went wrong, and it often did, someone had to be blamed. And the midwife, being the only professional in the room without a title or a robe, made a convenient target. Stillbirths were tragically common. Premature births, breech positions, and fatal infections meant that not every delivery ended with a cry. But while nature might have been the true culprit, neighbors didn't always see it that way. They remembered the midwife muttering something over a piece of bread. They remembered her bringing a dried lizard in her pouch last spring. They remembered a woman once said she made a charm out of cat bones. True or not, the story stuck. And then there was the question of sin. The church preached that original sin was washed away by baptism, but what if the baby died before the priest arrived? That's why emergency baptisms were permitted. But if the baby died anyway, it didn't stop the guilt. If the mother bled out, someone still had to explain it. Sometimes the explanation was medical. More often, it was spiritual. That's where saints and sinners collided in the midwife's hands. On the saintly side, midwives were revered when things went well. Some villages spoke of miracle midwives, women who could calm a stormy labor with a touch, who delivered breech babies with unshakable calm, who always seemed to be in the right place at the right time. They were thanked with gifts, sometimes honored in local legends, even remembered in family prayers for years. But when things went wrong, suddenly that same calm touch felt eerie. That same herbal remedy became suspect. The same woman who once delivered twins without a tear might now be accused of witchcraft if a baby was born with a caul over its face, or worse, if it never cried at all. Here's your fringe fact. In some parts of Europe, a baby born with a caul, a thin membrane over the face, was thought to be destined for greatness, or for sorcery. Midwives were said to keep the cauls, dry them, and sell them to sailors as lucky charms. Was it true? Probably in some cases. Was it enough to get you accused of consorting with dark forces? Absolutely. And if that weren't enough, sometimes midwives were blamed for things completely beyond their control. A baby born with a cleft lip? Must be punishment for the mother's sin, or maybe the midwife let a witch in during labor. A child who grew sick a few weeks after birth. Maybe the midwife cursed it. A woman who miscarried after eating a strange herb. Guess who gave it to her? Historians still argue how widespread these accusations were. Some scholars believe most midwives lived relatively peaceful lives, especially in tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone. Others point to court records and inquisitorial documents showing that midwives were overrepresented among women accused of heresy, witchcraft, or magical malpractice. Both can be true. In the village, you might be loved until you weren't. And still, the midwives came. They answered the knock at midnight, the scream in the dark. They delivered, even knowing that one bad birth could undo a lifetime of service. And when tragedy struck, as it inevitably did, they bore the blame with a quiet, bitter resolve. Some tried to protect themselves. They attended Mass. They kept relics. They made sure to speak Latin phrases at the right times and avoided eye contact when tensions flared. Others left the village altogether, moving to cities where anonymity offered safety, if not respect. But many stayed. Because despite the fear, the rumors, the danger, they believed in what they did. They believed they were helping. That birth was sacred. That a life delivered, even one that flickered only for a moment, was worth the risk. So you sit in that kitchen, the shadows lengthening, and you see it clearly now. The midwife, wiping her hands, checking the baby's breath, straightening the mother's bedding. Her shoulders are stiff, not from fatigue, but from bracing against what might come next. A priest with questions. A neighbor with suspicions. A husband with grief and no one else to blame. But for now, the child lives. The mother breathes. And the midwife stays. The castle is eerily quiet, but not from calm, more like the pause before a storm. You're inside a noblewoman's private chambers, where heavy tapestries muffle sound and the scent of rose oil tries, but fails, to cover the sharp tang of labor. A midwife kneels beside the bed, sleeves rolled up, tools ready, pulse steady. Because this birth isn't just about life. It's about legacy. Every noble family in medieval Europe lived and breathed succession. A healthy male heir was more valuable than gold, and more fragile than glass. And if the baby didn't arrive, or didn't arrive alive, entire political alliances could crumble. In this room, every contraction carries the weight of a dynasty, and the midwife is the only person who can tip the scales in the right direction. Unlike village births, noble deliveries often attracted an audience. No, not cheering crowds, but plenty of witnesses, high-ranking ladies-in-waiting, stewards, sometimes even male relatives loitering outside. Their job? To confirm that the child was born of the rightful mother, under legitimate circumstances, and not, say, swapped for someone else's baby. Yes, that was a genuine concern. Inheritance was everything, and where bloodlines were murky, accusations were only a breath away. Which is why the midwife had to be more than skilled, she had to be trusted. She might be summoned to the same family for generations, known by name in whispered family prayers. Or, in some cases, she might be replaced with someone more politically aligned, especially if tensions were high or the birth was particularly sensitive. Inside this chamber, there's no margin for error. The noblewoman's face is pale, her fingers digging into the brocade mattress. She's surrounded by luxury, but none of it makes the pain easier. The midwife murmurs softly, not just encouragement but coded updates to the surrounding women. They exchange glances. It's taking too long. If the child is born safely, pink, screaming, and obviously of noble blood, the midwife may receive a generous gift, a coin, a shawl, maybe even a place in the household. If something goes wrong, well, she might be escorted out the back door before anyone else sees. But it wasn't just about wealth or status. Midwives played a critical role in preserving lineage. They knew the birthing histories of noble women who'd had miscarriages, who struggled with fertility, who might be hiding a secret pregnancy. They could keep secrets. Or expose them. Their discretion was currency, and often their best protection. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In 15th century England, midwives were sometimes called upon to provide sworn testimony in inheritance disputes. If a nobleman died without a clear male heir, lawyers might consult the midwife who had attended the birth of his supposed children. Her word could make or break a claim. And here's your quirky fringe tidbit. In some royal courts, midwives were given elaborate titles. In France, sage-femme meant wise woman. In Spain, the term partera mea, chief midwife, referred to those who served queens, and sometimes oversaw other midwives, like a medieval birth director. They weren't just medical help. They were institutionalized parts of royal succession. Yet, despite their importance, most midwives weren't celebrated in court histories. You won't find their names in the lineage scrolls or family trees. Their contribution was invisible ink, present, essential, and utterly erased. And then there were the stillbirths, the miscarriages, the children who lived only long enough to complicate the line of inheritance. These events weren't always recorded publicly, but the midwife remembered. She knew which rooms had been silent instead of joyful. She knew which noble women were pushed to bear more children despite the toll on their bodies. She held that history in her hands, even when no one else dared speak of it. Historians still argue how much autonomy midwives really had in these settings. Were they advisors or just skilled servants? Some accounts suggest they wielded quiet power, able to influence decisions behind closed doors. Others say they were tools, respected, perhaps, but ultimately disposable. As always, the truth is likely somewhere in between. And there's one more thing: sometimes the baby was born disfigured, or with a mark, or with a silence that didn't lift. The midwife had to decide: present the child, no matter what, or shield the mother from what she couldn't bear to see. In some cases, these choices weren't hers to make, but the weight of them lived in her memory forever. So you stand in that chamber, the fire flickering low, the scent of blood and lavender thick in the air. The baby is finally born. He's breathing. Everyone exhales. The steward nods. The ladies murmur thanks to God. The midwife? She wipes her hands, presses a coin into her apron, and quietly checks that the afterbirth is complete, because the work isn't done just because there's a cry in the air. She's saved a lineage tonight. No title. No heralds. But the future just changed because of her hands. It's a grey morning, the kind that drips dread down your spine before you've even opened the shutters. A bell tolls from the village square, not for a feast day or a wedding. No, this bell is slower, deeper, and far more ominous. The plague has returned. You're in a small cottage near the edge of town, where the air smells of damp wool and desperation. Inside, the midwife is already working. Not in childbirth this time, but in preparation. Because even in the shadow of pestilence, babies still arrive. And the midwife still comes. The Black Death didn't knock politely. It kicked the door off its hinges. Between 1347 and 1351, it swept through Europe, killing somewhere between 30% to 60% of the population. Entire villages vanished. Fields went unharvested. And amidst the chaos, life didn't pause, it pressed on, raw and stubborn. Midwives found themselves in a harrowing new role, gatekeepers between a dying world and a fragile future. They had no masks, no hazmat suits, and no real understanding of germs. What they had were cloths soaked in vinegar, prayers muttered into linen, and nerves strong enough to walk into plague-ridden homes without flinching. And here's where it gets even more brutal. Pregnancy during plague years was both a hope and a horror. For some, it meant renewal, a sign that life could continue. For others, it was a trap. A woman's weakened body stood little chance if the pestilence came knocking. Childbirth was already dangerous. Add a fever that caused your skin to blacken and your lungs to collapse. That was a death sentence wrapped in a cradle. The midwife had to make impossible choices. If she'd been to a plague house, should she risk attending a birth? If a pregnant woman began to show symptoms, should she try to save the baby? Should she baptize an infant born to a mother who had just died gasping? Historians still argue whether midwives were more likely to die during plagues than the general population. Some say yes, because they never stopped working. Others argue that their herbal knowledge, isolation, and obsessive cleanliness may have actually given them an edge. Either way, their risk was real, and their bravery undeniable. One fringe tidbit for your sleepy brain: some midwives wore protective amulets sewn into their underclothes during plague years. These might be tiny pouches containing dried herbs, bits of parchment with biblical verses, or even crushed gemstones, believed to absorb the bad air. Did it work? Of course not. Did it help them feel like they had a fighting chance? Absolutely. And midwives didn't just deliver babies during plague years, they also helped bury the dead. In villages where the priest had died or fled, it was often the midwife who performed last rites. Not officially, of course, but someone had to say the words. Someone had to mark the graves. Someone had to carry the infant to the edge of the forest and place it gently into the earth. Their work expanded and contorted with the times. In some towns, midwives became unofficial public health officers, reporting sickness, tracking deaths, even advising on how to quarantine a household. It wasn't science, it was survival. And in many cases, they were the only authority left. And then came the suspicion. As death mounted and explanations faltered, people looked for someone to blame. A woman who entered every house, who handled blood and birth, who sometimes said prayers no one recognized. She became an easy scapegoat. In certain regions, midwives were accused of spreading the plague, either through ignorance or malice. Accusations flew. Inquisition records show midwives being interrogated for using plague powders or for allegedly poisoning mothers during labor. Some of them vanished. Some fled. Some stood their ground and kept delivering babies while others ran from the scent of illness. There's a story, half legend, half record, of a midwife in France who attended to both the richest noblewoman and the poorest beggar in a single day. Both in labor. Both during plague time. The noblewoman survived. The beggar didn't. That night, someone left a noose hanging from the midwife's doorpost. The implication was clear: choose better next time. But of course, there was no choice. Only duty. And through it all, the midwife adapted. She developed rituals, not just spiritual ones, but practical. Burn the linens after a birth. Avoid touching your face. Keep rosemary burning near the door. Wrap your mouth in cloth soaked in vinegar. These weren't foolproof, but they helped. And when the worst passed, when the bells stopped ringing and the air no longer smelled of death, the midwife stayed. Because babies still needed catching. Mothers still needed hands to hold. And the future, as ragged and fragile as it was, still needed building. So you're standing outside now, watching her exit the cottage after another birth. She moves slower these days, and the lines on her face are etched deeper than the village well. But she's alive. She's still here. And as long as she is, life has a chance. It's just before dawn, and the world is still wrapped in that strange quiet that only comes after a night of storms or of labor. You're in a one-room cottage, walls still glowing from the warmth of the hearth, and the baby has just been born. The air is thick with the raw, earthy scent of sweat, blood, and firewood. But something subtle shifts. A softer sound emerges, a mewling cry. The first breath. the first protest. And everyone exhales. Now begins the next stage, newborn care, medieval style. The midwife doesn't waste time. With steady hands, she lifts the baby, still slick with vernix, that creamy, wax-like coating that nature provides as a kind of biological armor. There's no sterile hospital blanket, no beeping monitors, just old linen warmed by the fire. The baby is wiped clean, as much for ritual as for hygiene. In some regions, the midwife sprinkles warm water gently over the baby's face, not as a full baptism, not yet, but to symbolically welcome the child into the world. Swaddling comes next. You probably imagine a cute little blanket wrap, but this is medieval swaddling, tight, intricate, and bordering on medieval bondage. Long strips of cloth bind the baby's arms to its sides, straightening legs and immobilizing twitchy newborn movements. The belief: a tightly swaddled baby would grow with straight limbs, a calm temperament, and, ideally, a healthy spine. Freedom of movement was considered chaotic, even dangerous. But there's more to this wrapping than superstition. In a time of unheated homes and chilly nights, swaddling provided essential warmth. A properly wrapped baby was easier to carry, easier to hang from a peg, yes, that happened, and easier to pass from one pair of arms to another. Some babies remained swaddled nearly all day, unwrapped only for cleaning and feeding. Speaking of feeding, the midwife often took a guiding role in that first moment. She'd help the mother position the newborn to nurse, watching closely for a proper latch. Breastfeeding wasn't automatic, it was a skill, one sometimes interrupted by sore nipples, poor milk production, or sheer post-birth exhaustion. If the mother couldn't nurse, a wet nurse was sometimes summoned. But that was more common among the wealthy. Most mothers in villages just did their best, or relied on herbal teas believed to encourage milk flow, fennel, cumin, and blessed thistle, to name a few. And then came the salt. Yes, salt. In many regions, newborns were rubbed with it, gently, but firmly. It was believed to toughen the skin, ward off infection, and symbolically purify the child. It also stung. But babies cry anyway, right? Salt was the first medicine, and in the eyes of many midwives, the first defense. Here's a quirky tidbit for your sleepy brain. In some parts of Europe, especially among Slavic communities, babies were briefly passed over the hearth fire, or at least the smoke, as a protective rite. Not enough to burn. Just enough to smoke out any lingering spirits or bad omens. The midwife performed this with a reverent, no-nonsense air. She wasn't playing. She was guarding. And the umbilical cord? Cut with a knife, boiled in water, if there was time. Tied with a bit of flax thread or horsehair, or sometimes even a strip of cloth from the mother's veil, which was believed to offer extra protection. The placenta was inspected carefully. A complete placenta meant a good omen. An incomplete one, not so much. It might be buried in the garden, fed to animals, or placed under the family hearth, depending on local customs. Then came naming. The midwife didn't name the baby, but she often asked. A name had to be declared quickly, especially if the child seemed weak. In cases of emergency, she would perform a full baptism, using any available water and the church's words. But even when there was no danger, she might still inquire. The family might choose a saint's name, hoping to invoke that holy protection. Or a grandparent's name, keeping lineage alive. some babies didn't live long. It's a truth that's hard to say aloud, but the midwife knew it. She didn't flinch when a baby failed to nurse. She watched. She listened. She advised quietly whether to keep trying, to bring in help, or, in heartbreaking cases, to begin preparing for mourning. Yet when things went right, and often they did, the atmosphere transformed. The mother, half asleep but triumphant. The baby, wrapped and warm, clutched to her chest. The midwife, quietly tidying up. She might leave a little charm near the cradle, a sprig of rosemary, a tiny cross made from straw, a drop of holy water on the baby's forehead. And always, always, she reminded the family of what came next. Cradle care. Nursing rhythm. Keeping the baby warm. Avoiding drafts and jealous spirits. Because in this world, a healthy baby wasn't just luck, it was a full-time occupation. Historians still debate how much of this care was superstition versus practical medicine. But honestly, for the medieval midwife, there was no such distinction. If it worked, she used it. If it didn't, she adjusted. Her knowledge wasn't split into science and magic, it was one tapestry, woven tight, with no threads wasted. So you leave the cottage now, stepping back into the cool air of the morning. Inside, the baby breathes softly, the mother sleeps, and the midwife walks down the lane to her next call, her hands still smelling faintly of salt and sage. And you realize, first cries weren't the end of her job. They were only the beginning. You're in a dim little corner of a bustling medieval market now, and all around you the air is thick with the scent of spices, sweat, and animal dung. Merchants shout over each other, women haggle over radishes, and a goose escapes from under a cart with a squawk of indignation. But tucked away between the fishmonger and the cloth merchant is a quieter figure, the midwife. Her basket isn't full of goods for sale. Not officially. But people keep approaching her anyway, slipping her coins or whispering questions behind their hands. Because what she offers can't be laid out on a table. What she offers is information, remedies, discretion. And when no one else can, or will, help, she often does. This is the underworld of reproductive knowledge. Not dark as in sinister, but shadowed by taboo. You don't shout across the market that your cycles have stopped, or that your belly is swelling without a husband to name. You speak to the midwife. Quietly. Carefully. She listens. Among her many unofficial roles, the midwife was often a silent steward of fertility and, occasionally, its prevention. Contraception, you ask? In a world ruled by religious doctrine and patriarchal inheritance? Oh yes, it existed. Not on posters or in pamphlets, but passed from mouth to ear like a secret recipe. Some of it was herbal. Pennyroyal, wild carrot seed, rue. These plants weren't foolproof, and they weren't gentle either. Some could cause cramping, others nausea. The line between birth control and poison was thin, and the dosage had to be just right. The midwife knew this line better than most. Sometimes too well. And here's your fringe tidbit. A handful of medieval texts describe pessaries, mixtures of herbs, vinegar, and animal fat inserted to prevent conception. One recipe even suggested crocodile dung, which seems optimistic at best. Historians still argue whether such practices were widespread or merely theoretical, but evidence suggests midwives knew more than they ever wrote down. Which is why discretion was key. Because the church, surprise surprise, had opinions. Officially, contraception was a sin. So was abortion. And yet, women came. Desperate women. Poor women. Even noble women. And sometimes, the midwife helped them. Not because she wanted to defy the church, but because she understood suffering. And she believed in mercy. Sometimes, the requests came not before a child, but after. A woman with too many mouths to feed. A girl hiding a lover's mistake. A widow who couldn't afford another baby in a world that punished single mothers. And yes, in rare and heartbreaking cases, women asked for something more final. Historians tiptoe around this part. Because records are scarce, and those that do exist are often cloaked in euphemism. Restorative tinctures. Menstrual cleansers. Womb purifiers. Were they intended to end pregnancies? Probably. Did midwives administer them? Almost certainly. But you won't find confessions, not in writing. Only whispers. The risk was enormous. If someone talked, if the woman became ill or died, the midwife could be accused of murder. Or worse, witchcraft. Still, many took the risk. Because to them, it wasn't about rebellion. It was about survival. Autonomy. Compassion in a world with very little of it to spare. There were limits, of course. Not every midwife would help. Some turned women away. Others offered only advice, not remedies. Some believed it was wrong. Others couldn't risk the exposure. But the ones who did, who whispered doses and mixed teas and pressed cool cloths to fevered brows, they were both healers and heretics, saints and sinners, walking that razor's edge with every hidden request. And yet, most of the time, the market scene wasn't so dramatic. A girl might ask for help with painful monthly cramps. A wife might want something to cool the womb before her husband returned from war. A young woman might just want to know if what she was feeling was normal. The midwife answered. Patiently. Kindly. With the kind of clarity born from experience, not books. Sometimes she carried dried herbs wrapped in cloth, tucked in the folds of her apron. Other times, she sent the woman to the woods with instructions, pick only what grows in shade, or boil it, never eat it raw. These weren't potions from fairy tales. They were kitchen magic, survival skills, and desperate hopes all stirred together. And here's the twist, some women came not for birth control, but for the opposite. They wanted to conceive. To finally carry a child to term. To stop losing babies to the silence of the womb. And for them, the midwife offered hope. Special teas. Fertility rites. Quiet prayers said over moonlit waters. She became the confidant of both ends of the reproductive spectrum, gatekeeper to both prevention and possibility. You watch her now, slipping through the market crowd. Her basket seems empty, but it's heavy with secrets. She nods to the butcher, the blacksmith's wife, the merchant who's already sent 3 daughters to her care. No one says what she does. But everyone knows who to call when the body confuses, betrays, or frightens. The midwife isn't just the one who catches babies. She's the one who catches whispers. And sometimes, that's the most important work of all. It's the middle of the night again, of course it is, and the wind howls through the thatched roofs as if it, too, is anxious about what's happening inside. You're in a cramped room, lit only by a flickering candle and the dull red glow of coals in the hearth. The midwife is here, kneeling at the foot of a straw-stuffed mattress, sleeves rolled up, jaw set. Something's wrong. The mother's been laboring for too long. Her breath comes in gasps now, less from exertion and more from exhaustion. The baby hasn't turned. Or it's caught. Or maybe it's something worse, something unspoken but deeply felt. This is one of those births. The ones the midwife dreads. The ones where you start thinking about which outcome is the least tragic, not which is best. In medieval Europe, childbirth was always risky. But sometimes it spiraled beyond risk into a nightmare. And when it did, there was no surgeon on standby, no anesthetic waiting, no emergency cesarean as a last resort. There was just the midwife. Her hands. Her knowledge. And the increasingly desperate prayers echoing through the room. When things went wrong, they went wrong fast. A breech birth, a baby coming feet or buttocks first, could be fatal for both mother and child. If the baby was too large, or the mother's pelvis too narrow, labor could stall completely. Infections could set in. Hemorrhages could start without warning. And the midwife had to act. Not always to save, but to salvage. Here's a mainstream historical fact that doesn't get nearly enough air. Before the invention of forceps in the 17th century, midwives used their fingers, small knives, or even fish hooks to maneuver stuck babies. It sounds brutal, because it was. But when you're faced with a mother who will die without intervention, and maybe a child you can't save, you do what you can. There's one case recorded in a 14th century Parisian account where a midwife, finding a dead fetus stuck in the birth canal, carefully dismembered the body to remove it and spare the mother. She survived. The baby didn't. But the midwife's calm, brutal knowledge turned a double funeral into one. These were decisions no one wanted to make. And the emotional toll was immense. Midwives didn't get to grieve. They had to stay steady. They had to keep moving. They had to attend to the mother, if she survived, or help prepare her body if she didn't. And here's your fringe fact of the night. In some communities, when a mother died in childbirth, the midwife was expected to stay with her body until burial. It was seen as a kind of penance, or perhaps a sacred duty. She had helped the woman into this world's final transformation, and she had to stay until the last step was complete. Historians still debate whether midwives were offered enough emotional support, or any at all. Some suggest that midwives formed informal sisterhoods, sharing stories and comfort when no one else understood. Others argue that they bore the burden in silence, expected to simply carry on. The truth, likely, is both. Some midwives broke. Some hardened. Some whispered their regrets into the wind and kept going anyway. There were also political consequences when things went wrong. A noblewoman who died in childbirth could trigger a power vacuum. A merchant's wife might leave behind debts and no heir. A village might lose a potential future worker, mother, or wife. And the midwife? She might be questioned, accused, punished, even if she did everything right. Sometimes, when a baby was stillborn, the midwife would insist on immediate baptism, even posthumously, with a drop of water and a whispered rite. She did it not because she thought it would raise the child, but because she hoped it would calm the parents, ease the grief, offer some measure of peace. You're watching her now, in this small room. The baby has come, but not breathing. The mother lies still, her chest rising faintly, like a tide that might yet return. The midwife swaddles the silent infant, cradles it for a moment, just a moment, and then gently lays it aside. There are no tears. Not here. Not yet. There's work to do. The mother needs tending. The bedding must be changed. The fire stoked. A message sent to the local priest. And later, a grave prepared. And tomorrow? She'll be called again. To another home. Another birth. Another gamble. This is the part of midwifery no one celebrates. The quiet, crushing aftermath. The ones you couldn't save. The nights you replay again and again, wondering if you missed a sign, if you made the right call, if a stronger prayer, a different herb, a steadier hand might have changed the ending. But there's no time for that now. The sky is starting to lighten. The rooster crows. And the midwife, shoulders heavy but posture straight, steps outside. Because life goes on, even when it doesn't. You're in a scriptorium now, surrounded by the slow scratch of quills and the faint smell of ink and vellum. Monks shuffle past with armfuls of parchment, their robes brushing the stone floor in rhythmic swishes. You stand near a bench where an old manuscript lies open, its pages yellowed, its margins inked with curling letters and curious little drawings. And there, in between the Latin prayers and liturgical texts, is something unexpected, a sketch of a woman kneeling beside a pregnant figure. A midwife, hidden in the margins. This is how midwives entered history, not in bold titles or official chronicles, but in scribbled notes and flickering images. They were not the heroes of epic poems. They didn't sign royal edicts. But they were there, inked into the folds of the everyday, preserved in whispers on parchment. You might think such records are rare, and you'd be right. Medieval manuscripts don't tend to celebrate midwives. But when you know where to look, they appear in medical treatises, court documents, church registers, and yes, even in illuminated manuscripts, where their presence is symbolic as much as documentary. Take, for instance, the Tranquil texts, a collection of medieval writings on women's health attributed, maybe, to a female physician from Salerno. These texts described various aspects of childbirth and gynecology in practical detail, offering advice that midwives would have recognized instantly: how to turn a breech baby, what herbs to use for inducing labor, how to treat infections after birth. But was Tranquil a real woman? Historians still argue. Some think she was a composite. Others suspect her writings were later edited, or stolen, by men seeking credibility. Either way, her legacy is one of the few places where female-centric medicine made it into ink. And for that, medieval midwives owe her a wink of gratitude across the centuries. In legal texts, midwives show up in less poetic ways. Sometimes they're witnesses, especially in inheritance cases. If someone questioned the legitimacy of a child, the midwife might be summoned to testify. Yes, she'd say. I saw the birth. That baby came from that woman. Her word, in those moments, was as binding as any priest's. And yet, despite the trust placed in her then, she often disappeared from the written record afterward. Here's a quirky tidbit. In one 15th century manuscript from Catalonia, a birth record includes a doodle of a midwife holding a spoon. Why? because she was reportedly feeding the laboring woman a mixture of honey and wine to give her strength. It's a detail no chronicler would bother with, but someone, perhaps a young monk with a mischievous eye, decided it was worth capturing. Still, not all mentions are flattering. In some sermons, midwives are described with suspicion, accused of using Christian methods, or relying too heavily on folk remedies. One cleric even warned his congregation that midwives might tie the devil to the umbilical cord. Charming. Art, too, tells part of the story. In nativity scenes, those glowing depictions of Mary giving birth to Jesus, midwives occasionally appear in the background. Two women, usually, sometimes holding a bowl of water, sometimes lifting the Christ child for washing. They're not always labeled, but scholars agree these are midwives, quietly inserted into the most sacred birth narrative of all. Why include them? Perhaps to root the divine in the everyday. To remind viewers that even holy births involved blood and breath and human hands. But over time, these figures faded. In later Renaissance paintings, the midwives vanish, replaced by angels or saints. History, as always, edited them out. Historians still debate how much we can trust the few mentions we have. Were they exceptional cases, or representative of broader, unrecorded truths? Was the midwife in a legal record typical, or just the one who happened to be noticed? The answer matters less than the pattern. Midwives existed, worked, saved lives, and were largely ignored. Until now. Because modern scholarship has started to shine a light on these invisible women. Feminist historians, archaeologists, and medical anthropologists are piecing together the midwife's world from fragments, bone tools found in graves, herbal recipes scribbled in cookbooks, oral traditions passed down through families. And here you are, standing over that old manuscript, reading a phrase in Latin that loosely translates to, "Let the woman be guided by the one who knows." It's not signed. It's barely legible. But it's there. The midwife, guiding still. The room is too crowded, too warm, too loud, and somehow, it's still considered private. You're in a grand stone chamber, velvet curtains drawn, fire roaring, and half the royal court either gathered outside or pressing their ears to the heavy oak doors. It's not a party. It's a birth. A royal one. And the midwife is at the center of it, orchestrating what might be the most politically charged moment of the entire reign. Unlike village births, royal deliveries weren't just personal. They were public events, cloaked in ritual, expectation, and no small amount of paranoia. The stakes were high. A healthy heir meant dynastic stability. A stillbirth, or worse, a disputed lineage, could trigger civil war. So when a queen or princess went into labor, the midwife wasn't just delivering a child. She was delivering national security. First things first, privacy was a fantasy. The birthing chamber might be declared closed, but that didn't mean it was empty. Trusted noblewomen stood by, some to assist, others simply to witness. And yes, sometimes, men waited just outside, including physicians, stewards, or even the king himself. Not because they were helpful, but because they wanted proof. Here's your mainstream historical fact. In 1688, the birth of James II's son in England was attended by dozens of witnesses to ensure the baby wasn't a changeling, a child smuggled in to secure a Catholic succession. The midwife was expected to verify everything, from the labor's duration to the baby's first cry. Witnesses even checked under the bed. That's an extreme case, but it wasn't unique. Earlier in the Middle Ages, similar pressures existed. The midwife was often asked to swear an oath before attending a royal birth, vowing to uphold truth, confidentiality, and loyalty to the crown. Her presence was both medical and political. One wrong word, and she could be accused of treason. In this room, the midwife walks a tightrope. She has to manage the laboring woman's pain without alarming the observers. She has to shield the queen from too much exposure, yet also ensure that witnesses can verify the birth. It's performance art meets emergency medicine, and she's the director. And then there's the naming. Royal babies weren't just named. They were christened with intention, loaded with symbolic meaning. The midwife might not choose the name, but she often carried the child to its first bath, its first priestly blessing, even its first embroidered bonnet. She might whisper a quick prayer under her breath, her own offering, not part of the ceremony, but just as sacred. Let's throw in a quirky detail. Some royal courts believed that a child born en call, still wrapped in the amniotic sac, was destined for greatness. The midwife, upon seeing this rare event, would carefully peel away the membrane, preserving it as a good luck charm. In some cases, the caul was dried and placed in the royal treasury, a relic as revered as a saint's tooth. But not every royal birth went well. When complications arose, the stakes doubled. A queen who died in childbirth left behind more than grief, she left a kingdom in turmoil. If the baby survived, the midwife might be hailed as a hero. If both perished, questions would follow. Was the midwife too slow? Was her technique unholy? Could a physician have done better? Historians still argue about whether male physicians were really more effective, or simply more visible. In royal courts, their presence increased over time, especially by the 15th century. But many queens still preferred midwives, especially those they'd known for years. Trust mattered more than titles. And trust, as always, was fragile. There's a record of a midwife in 14th century Aragon who was banished from court after a noblewoman's child was stillborn. Not because she did anything wrong, but because the optics were bad. The court needed someone to blame, and she had no family to protect her. She vanished into history, name unrecorded. But for every forgotten midwife, there were those who earned royal favor. Some were granted pensions, land, or even titles, quiet acknowledgements of their role in the birth of kings. One French midwife, in the late Middle Ages, was given her own coat of arms, a swaddled infant on a blue field. A rare honor for someone who never sat on a throne. So you stand now, in this heated chamber, watching the moment unfold. The queen screams. The baby arrives. The room holds its breath. And the midwife, calm in the storm, lifts the child, clears its lungs, and offers the first triumphant cry to the waiting crowd outside. And just like that, a kingdom exhales. You're out in the countryside now, far from the echoing halls of castles and the bustle of market towns. The fields stretch wide and gold around a little hamlet nestled in a soft curve of hills. The houses are wooden, the roofs thatched, and chickens roam freely underfoot. A woman is in labor again, nothing dramatic, no royal guards, no waiting scribes. Just a family, some neighbors, and a midwife who's seen it all before. This is where midwives did the bulk of their work, in villages. Tiny, close-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, and yet somehow, the midwife knew even more. She was the quiet thread running through every life here, present at births, deaths, and everything in between. And in these small places, she wasn't just a healer, she was part of the social glue. Unlike in towns or noble houses, village midwives rarely had official titles or written licenses. Their authority came from lived experience and community memory. People trusted her not because of a bishop's seal but because she delivered their cousins, their neighbors, their own siblings. Her reputation was her badge. But that reputation could be a double-edged sword. If a birth went wrong, there weren't legal protections. No court of medical review. Just gossip. And in a village, gossip traveled faster than horses. If a midwife made a single mistake, or even just had bad luck, she might find doors closing and prayers said behind her back. Still, she endured. In fact, she thrived. Because rural midwives knew things that no priest or noble physician ever would. They knew how to treat the mother who bled too much with stinging nettle boiled into a bitter tea. They knew how to comfort the laboring girl whose husband had left for war and wasn't coming back. They knew how to blend rosemary and sage to ward off evil from a cradle, or how to wrap a newborn against frostbite using nothing but wool scraps and motherly instinct. One quirky detail for your sleep-hungry brain: in some regions, village midwives were also amateur veterinarians. That's right, if your cow was having a difficult birth, you called the same woman who helped with babies. Why? Because she knew how bodies worked, how to feel for turning, how to keep calm under pressure. So the midwife might go from birthing a calf in the morning to delivering twins in the evening, her apron still damp and hands smelling faintly of hay. The midwife was more than a health worker, she was a counselor. Women came to her with fears about infertility, anxieties over menstruation, or worries about their marriages. She kept confidences, dispensed quiet wisdom, and sometimes offered herbal remedies to soothe more than just physical pain. A little valerian for a grieving widow. A mugwort bundle for a woman who feared her third miscarriage. In these villages, births weren't solitary affairs either. They were communal, though always centered around women. Female relatives, friends, and neighbors gathered to support the mother, guided by the midwife's steady hand. These women were called gossips, not in the way we use it today, but from God's sibs, spiritual kin. They helped in birth, not just by fetching water or holding the mother up, but by weaving a network of care that stretched into the child's early years. Historians still puzzle over how much influence these rural midwives had in shaping community health. Some argue they were proto-doctors, others say they were more spiritual figures than medical ones. But ask any villager from that era, and they'd likely say the same thing: she saved lives. Again and again. And when the village faced bigger threats, famine, plague, war, it was the midwife who often stayed. She didn't have the luxury of fleeing to a country estate. She was already in the country. And so she kept working. Through hunger. Through fear. Through heartbreak. There are stories, buried in parish records and oral histories, of midwives walking miles in snow to reach a woman in labor. Of births on the floor of barns, in candlelit kitchens, by riversides when the house was too far to reach. These women didn't carry swords or wear armor, but make no mistake, they were warriors of their own kind. And when they grew old, they became living repositories of wisdom. Younger women came to learn from them, not formally, but by observation. By helping at births, by brewing herbs, by watching how she handled a screaming infant or a breech delivery. This was how midwifery passed from one generation to the next, through quiet apprenticeship, not diplomas. You watch now as the midwife wipes her hands and steps outside, a steaming cup of broth pressed into her fingers by a grateful father. The baby's cries echo through the walls, and neighbors smile in relief. Life continues. And once again, it's thanks to her. She doesn't ask for recognition. She doesn't need it. In this village, her name is known, her hands are trusted, and her legacy, though unwritten, is stitched into every family she's touched. The village fair is in full swing, and you're wading through a sea of laughter, clinking mugs, the tang of roasted onions, and the occasional goat nipping at a child's tunic. Amidst all the revelry, you spot her, not at the center of the crowd, but near the edges. The midwife. She's not shouting or dancing or trading wool for cider. But she's here, observing, quiet, present. Because even at festivals, her work never really stops. You might not think of celebration and childbirth in the same breath, but in the medieval world, the line between life's solemnity and its joy was blurrier than you'd imagine. And for midwives, festivals weren't just about fun, they were part of the job. The calendar was packed with saint days, harvest feasts, and religious observances. Many of these had connections, however loose, to fertility, family, and protection, concepts squarely in the midwife's domain. She might be asked to lead prayers for a woman hoping to conceive, or to bless an infant born just before Michaelmas. Sometimes she even carried herbs or charms believed to be stronger when gathered during specific festivals, like St. John's Eve or the Feast of the Assumption. One mainstream fact, Candlemas, celebrated in early February, was more than just a church ritual. In some regions, midwives were honored during this feast, blessed candles were given to them, thought to protect mother and child during difficult deliveries. It was a rare moment of recognition, a kind of thank you whispered from the altar. But those blessings didn't make her untouchable. Festivals, with their crowds and drinking and sudden bursts of chaos, could just as easily turn dangerous. If a labor started unexpectedly during a fair, the midwife might have to push through a crowd of dancing bodies to reach a panicked father or a collapsing woman. If a baby was born under the stars, among laughing revelers and stomping boots, it was the midwife who turned that chaos into calm. Here's your quirky fringe tidbit. In some Germanic villages, it was believed that a baby born during a fair would grow up lucky with the animals, and might even speak the language of beasts. Midwives, in these cases, were asked to record the exact moment of birth and sometimes hang a special token, like a braided straw ribbon, above the cradle for good fortune. But fairs weren't just about superstition. They were information hubs. Midwives who traveled, even just between nearby villages, used fairs to exchange remedies, swap advice, and sometimes deliver news. Did you hear about the woman in Glenfort? £12, and the baby's fine. Marigold tea? No, try crushed cumin. Works better. They didn't gather like formal guilds, but midwives often sought each other out. A shared smile. A quick confession. A gentle laugh over stubborn first-time fathers or babies born with hair thick enough to braid. These brief exchanges weren't gossip. They were survival. Because the midwife wasn't just a local expert, she was a lifelong learner. Her education didn't end after a few births. It continued every day, through observation, through story, through accidental discoveries and shared failures. Fairs and festivals offered a rare chance to meet someone new who'd seen something different, and to tuck that knowledge away for the next call in the night. Yet even here, surrounded by music and dancing, she remained half on duty. You notice her glance toward a young couple walking slowly, the woman's hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. A moment later, she's beside them, speaking low, offering what looks like a small cloth bundle, probably herbs for swelling, or a charm stitched with simple prayers. Historians still argue whether midwives had any formal role in these community events, or whether they simply inserted themselves because they had to. But records show that midwives often served as informal coordinators for feast day rituals related to childbirth, fertility, or infant blessings. Some even worked with priests to organize christening processions, particularly when multiple children were born around the same time. Because when the music stopped, and the fire died down, and the banners were packed away, birth didn't wait. No matter how many mugs were emptied or how many saints had been toasted, the call came. And the midwife answered. You watch her now, slipping between a stall selling candied nuts and a game involving poorly balanced barrels. She doesn't need a crown or a badge. The village knows her. They nod, offer bread, make way. Even the drunkest celebrant steps aside when she passes. She's not the life of the party, but she's the guardian of what comes after. The fire's burning low in a small stone house, casting long shadows across shelves lined with jars, some filled with herbs, others with things harder to name. The air smells of chamomile, damp stone, and old parchment. You're in the home of a midwife now, not during a birth, not during a crisis, but during her quiet hours, if you can call them that. Because here's the secret, medieval midwives didn't just appear when someone cried out in labor. They prepared. They studied. They created. And behind closed doors, they practiced a kind of alchemy, part science, part superstition, part hard-earned experience. This is the midwife's workshop, her apothecary, her library, and sometimes her chapel. Shelves grown under bundles of dried sage and tansy, pots of honey and vinegar, strips of linen, beeswax candles, and herbal mixtures with names like Mother's Comfort and Womb-Warming Brew. Everything has its place. Everything has its story. She keeps a careful balance. Too much of one root? Dangerous. Too little of another? Useless. This isn't guesswork, it's the result of years watching which babies survived, which mothers healed, which teas soothed cramps or restored appetite. You think she just delivers babies? She's a chemist with dirt under her nails and no official title. Mainstream historical fact, many midwives kept recipe books, written in the margins of religious texts, in household ledgers, or just committed to memory. These included remedies for labor pain, post-birth bleeding, infertility, and even emotional distress. Because medieval medicine wasn't just about bodies. It was about balance, of humors, of spirits, of fate. And here's your fringe tidbit. Some midwives made talismans to hang above a newborn's cradle, little pouches sewn from red thread, filled with wormwood, salt, or even crushed bones of animals. They weren't decorations. They were protection. Against envy, against demons, against the evil eye, which could supposedly wither a baby just by being stared at too long. This room, tucked away from the village square, held a kind of sacred energy. It was where knowledge was passed on, not in universities, but across tables slick with beeswax and old ink. Younger women apprenticed here, slowly. They started by fetching water, grinding herbs, boiling cloths. Then, one day, they were invited to assist at a birth. Not lead, just assist. If they fainted or fumbled, they were scolded, but gently. And if they stayed, they learned. The midwife's home was a sanctuary and a school, though not everyone saw it that way. Suspicion followed her jars. Rumors clung to her dried roots and secret mixtures. She's always brewing something, they'd whisper. She never gets sick. That's not natural. And if something bad happened in town, a death, a failed birth, a sudden illness, it wasn't uncommon for frightened villagers to glance her way with narrowed eyes. Historians still argue how much of this suspicion was rooted in fear of women's knowledge, or just a general discomfort with the invisible power she wielded. The church, as you'll recall, had mixed feelings. Some clerics blessed midwives. Others accused them of meddling in divine affairs. And yet, even priests sent for her when their sisters or housemaids went into labor. Because theory is one thing, practical necessity is another. You glance now at the corner of her work table. A worn cloth covers something round, beneath it, maybe a carved birthing amulet, passed down from her teacher's teacher. Or perhaps a skull used for teaching anatomy. She doesn't show it to everyone. But she knows you're watching, and she lifts the cloth just an inch, lets you see. Then covers it again. Not all her tools are so mysterious. A birthing stool sits near the fire, its wood polished smooth by decades of use. Beside it, a leather pouch containing herbs for stopping bleeding, yarrow, shepherd's purse, raspberry leaf. Nearby, a pot of clarified butter and lard, used to ease delivery, soothe tears, or anoint a baby's dry skin. And she keeps notes, sometimes just symbols scratched onto wood, sometimes letters only she can read. She tracks moon phases, weather, dreams, the color of a mother's cheeks the night before labor. Not because she believes in magic, necessarily, but because patterns matter. Observations save lives. Sometimes she sings as she works, low, rhythmic chants in a dialect older than the village itself. Songs her own teacher sang. Songs that settle the nerves, mark the minutes, call courage into the room like a familiar friend. This, you realize, is her real power. Not just catching babies, but weaving together the threads of what people know and what they believe, of what's written and what's whispered. In a world where science, spirit, and superstition all lived in the same room, the midwife kept the peace between them. You leave her now, standing by the fire, gently stirring a thick, fragrant brew. It's for a mother 2 villages over, 3rd child, nervous heart, slow milk. She'll walk there tomorrow. But tonight, she prepares. Because no one saves lives with empty hands. Now you're standing at the edge of a muddy field where the sky hangs low and grey, and a wooden cart creaks by, heavy with sacks of grain, and silence. The church bell tolls again, slow and hollow. War has come to the village, and with it, the long shadows of absence. Fathers gone. Brothers missing. Homes half empty. And in the middle of all this, a midwife, sleeves rolled up, as always. Medieval wars weren't fought on battlefields alone. They bled into every corner of life. They tore families apart, disrupted food supplies, spread disease, and cast long, uncertain shadows over every household. For midwives, war didn't pause their work. It made it harder. And somehow, more essential. You see, when men went to war, women carried on. They plowed the fields, guarded the homes, and raised the children, many of whom were conceived in hurried passion, born into worry, and swaddled in uncertainty. The midwife became more than a caretaker, she was the last thread holding the community together. One mainstream historical fact: during the 100 Years' War, rural areas in France and England saw massive disruptions in childbirth services. Physicians fled. Monasteries closed their doors. But midwives stayed. In some towns, they were the only form of medical help for miles. And here's your fringe tidbit: in border villages, especially near conflict zones, some midwives kept coded herb bundles, little knots of cloth that told other healers whether the household had suffered a death, a birth, or an illness. These bundles were left near doors or hung on fence posts, a kind of primitive communication system in times of fear and silence. The midwife now wasn't just catching babies. She was helping mothers deliver while their husbands were gone or presumed dead. She was comforting widows, treating battlefield wounds from survivors who stumbled home half-healed. And, occasionally, she helped hide pregnancies born of violence, when soldiers took what they wanted, and the aftermath left women broken in more ways than one. No one talked about those babies. But the midwife saw them. She wrapped them just the same. She didn't ask questions she knew wouldn't be answered. In these dark years, the church's grip sometimes loosened. Priests were fewer, rites rushed. And so the midwife stepped further into spiritual roles, baptizing babies, praying over the dying, anointing the sick. Not because she was trying to defy doctrine, but because there was no one else. And when death came, because it always did, she helped with that too. She closed the eyes. She washed the body. She guided the grieving. Birth and death blurred together in wartime, happening sometimes in the same room, just hours apart. There's an old tale from a German town near the Rhine, a midwife who delivered 5 babies in 3 days during a siege. On the 4th day, she carried one of those newborns, now motherless, to a nearby monastery and begged the monks to take it in. They did. The child grew up to be a healer himself. The midwife's name wasn't recorded. Of course it wasn't. But the monastery's records list a woman of hands and kindness. Historians still debate how midwives balanced their compassion with the darker demands of war. Did they turn people away when supplies ran low? Did they ever flee? Some must have. But the stories that survive, the ones passed down, speak of resilience. Of soot-covered aprons, of travel on foot across broken roads, of whispered lullabies sung beneath shattered rafters. And always, the midwife kept moving. Sometimes she was the only adult a group of children had left. She taught girls how to boil water, how to clean wounds, how to birth kittens before babies. These were not lessons for peacetime. These were survival skills. You watch her now, stepping out of a cottage where another birth has just taken place. She cradles a bundle of linens, not a child this time, but soiled cloths she'll clean herself. She's tired. But there's another house to visit. A boy with a fever. A widow too weak to cook. She's needed, not because life is beautiful right now, but because it must go on. War didn't make her job noble. It made it harder. But somehow, it also made her irreplaceable. The wind is rattling the shutters tonight, and you're perched on a stool inside a candlelit kitchen, the kind where the walls lean just a bit and everything smells like dried thyme, wood smoke, and long-held secrets. The midwife is at the table, not delivering a baby, not tending a wound, but speaking quietly. Across from her sits a young woman, barely out of girlhood, staring into a steaming mug with eyes full of worry. This, too, is midwifery. Because birth doesn't start with contractions. It starts with questions. With worries. With late periods and whispered doubts. And sometimes, what the midwife offers isn't medicine or a warm hand, it's advice, cloaked in careful words and generations of wisdom. Midwives were often the first people women turned to when things didn't feel right. And not just physically. Emotionally. Spiritually. Socially. The midwife listened when others judged. She held space when others dismissed. And she offered the kind of counsel that only someone who's seen everything, life, death, joy, shame, could truly give. In this particular moment, the midwife is helping the girl understand what her body might be doing. Could she be pregnant? Possibly. Is it dangerous? Maybe. Will the father return? No one knows. But through gentle questions and practical steps, the midwife helps her think. Plan. Breathe. One mainstream historical fact: many midwives served as informal therapists in their communities. They counseled women on marriage troubles, helped grieving mothers recover after stillbirths, and guided young girls through puberty with a mix of herbal remedies and mythic storytelling. They weren't licensed to do this. They just did. And your fringe tidbit? Some midwives, particularly in Celtic regions, were also trained in dream interpretation. A woman might come to the midwife not because she was in labor, but because she'd had a strange dream involving fish, or rivers, or birds, and she wanted to know what it meant. The midwife would listen, nod, and perhaps brew a tea while explaining what the symbols might suggest about fertility, healing, or fate. Advice wasn't just about bodies. It was about roles, expectations, fears. A woman pregnant out of wedlock faced exile, punishment, or worse. A midwife couldn't erase those threats, but she could help a woman navigate them. Suggest a relative in another village. Provide herbs that restored monthly flow. Offer names of sympathetic gossips or secluded hiding places. And when a pregnancy was wanted but the woman was older, or afraid, or simply uncertain, the midwife's words mattered just as much as her hands. "You're strong," she might say. "I've seen harder births. We'll be ready." And that small comfort, it could mean everything. Historians still argue whether midwives were more practical than spiritual in their counsel. Some records suggest they leaned heavily on saints and prayers. Others depict them as earthy realists, grounded in blood and bone. Most likely, they were both, toggling between sacred and secular with quiet ease. This duality made them valuable and dangerous. Because in a world governed by rigid roles, a woman who advised other women, who helped them bend or survive the rules, was always a little suspicious. Especially when her advice ran counter to a husband's command or a priest's warning. "She told my wife to rest more," one man might complain. "Now she won't do her chores." Or, "She gave her a potion that made her sleep for days." And suddenly, helpful became threatening. So the midwife was careful. Her words were chosen not just for accuracy but for tone. She could soothe or scare, depending on what was needed. A girl terrified of labor might be told it was no worse than a hard day in the fields. Another might be warned of the pain, so she wouldn't panic when it came. Each woman received a different truth, tailored to her needs. And she wasn't always soft. Midwives could be blunt. "You can't keep bleeding like this," she might say. "You need to stop lifting barrels." Or, "You can't hide this baby much longer." Her kindness was edged with urgency. Because in her line of work, pretending was dangerous. But when a woman was ready to carry a child, to birth it, to raise it, her midwife was more than a guide. She was an anchor. The one who'd be there at every step. Who would show her how to wrap the baby, how to nurse without pain, how to recognize fever. And maybe most importantly, how to trust herself. Because even when others doubted her, her mother, her in-laws, her husband, the midwife would say, "You're the mother now. You'll know." You glance over at the pair again. The young woman is still staring into her mug, but her shoulders have relaxed. The midwife hasn't promised miracles. She's just given her a plan. A sense of control. A little peace. And in this world, that's everything. You're walking through a forest path now, early morning dew dampening your boots and a thick mist clinging low to the underbrush. There's birdsong above and the occasional snap of a twig beneath, but mostly, there's quiet. Just ahead, you see her, hood pulled up, basket in hand, moving with purpose. The midwife, gathering her secrets. Because her work didn't stop at hearths and cradles. It began, often, here, in nature. In the fields, forests, and meadows that surrounded her village like a vast, breathing apothecary. This was her pharmacy, her library, her sacred ground. She knew every plant, every root, every berry that could heal and every one that could kill. And the difference? Sometimes just a leaf's width. Her knowledge came from generations, from old women's whispers and trial by error. It was memorized, not written. Lived, not theorized. Mainstream historical fact, many midwives were also herbalists, not as a side gig, but as an essential part of their practice. They knew which herbs soothed pain, like willow bark, the medieval aspirin, and which could stimulate contractions, like blue cohosh or ergot. And because official medicine was limited, expensive, and often inaccessible, her herbs were often the only drugs available. But it wasn't just medicine. It was ritual. She picked certain plants at dawn, others under a full moon. She whispered words, not spells, exactly, but not casual mutterings either. She left small offerings, a coin, a strand of hair, a crust of bread. Why? Because in her world, nature gave generously, but always expected respect. And she, wise enough not to gamble with mystery, gave it. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some regions, especially in Eastern Europe, midwives believed that certain herbs sang when picked at the right time. Not literally, but through the rustle of their leaves or the smell they gave off. It was said you could hear a plant's blessing if you were quiet enough. Whether true or not, the midwife always listened. She dried her finds carefully, storing them in bundles above the hearth, labeling them with symbols only she and maybe her apprentice understood. She steeped some into teas, ground others into powders, or soaked roots in oil to rub into aching joints. Her methods weren't guesswork, they were born from repetition, correction, and a kind of natural intuition modern science still envies. Historians still argue whether these herbal practices were scientific or folk magic. But let's be honest, those lines are blurry. If a remedy worked, it was medicine. If it didn't, it was forgotten. And many of her remedies did work, which is why you can find versions of them in pharmacology books today. But plants weren't her only source. She also watched animals. Birds that circled low, dogs that refused to enter a home, these were signs. Bees abandoning a hive before a baby's birth. A bad omen. Frogs croaking in chorus outside a cottage. Perhaps a sign of fertility. She didn't control nature. She read it, like a book written in green ink and rustling paper. And when someone scoffed, when a young priest or skeptical merchant muttered about witchy old women, she said nothing. She just waited. Because eventually, even skeptics got sick. Or their wives went into labor. Or their children spiked a fever. And then, they came knocking. Not all her work was solo, though. Sometimes she joined other women, healers, root gatherers, brewers of balm. They shared tips, traded dried bundles, argued over dosage. These were not witches' covens. They were field clinics, mobile libraries, support networks. Unofficial. Unrecorded. Unbreakable. And when herbs failed, when the mother bled too much or the baby didn't turn, she turned to her fallback, prayer. Not always the church's version. Sometimes older. Sometimes stranger. A chant in a forgotten dialect. A name whispered into the water. A plea, soft and urgent, to the forest itself. Not because she believed the forest would intervene, but because she had to believe something would. Hope, in her world, was an ingredient too. You watch her now, crouching to pull a root from the soft earth, shaking off dirt, inspecting it with practiced eyes. She nods once, satisfied, then adds it to her basket. Around her, the forest stirs, not disturbed by her presence but welcoming it. Because she belongs here, not as a trespasser, but as a partner. She doesn't exploit. She collaborates. When she returns to the village, someone will be waiting. Always. A woman in early labor. A child with a cough. A man with aching joints. And the bundle she carries, muddy, fragrant, magical in the old sense of the word, might just be the difference between healing and heartbreak. And all of it, it started here. On this path. In this silence. With her, listening. The candles flicker low in the chapel tonight, their tiny flames reflected in stained glass that's more lead than color in this village's modest church. You're sitting near the back, watching as the midwife kneels, not in fear, but in routine reverence. She doesn't come here for every birth, or even every prayer. But she comes. Because even she, with all her herbal knowledge and midnight experience, knows that some things are bigger than her hands. Midwives and religion, now there's a complicated story. In theory, they worked for the same team, both devoted to life, both concerned with souls. But in practice, the church was suspicious. Always had been. Yet it couldn't do without them. You see, the midwife held a strange kind of authority, one usually reserved for clergy. In emergencies, especially if a baby was dying or stillborn, she had the power to baptize. Not just allowed, expected. Because in the eyes of the Church, an unbaptized soul hovered dangerously close to eternal limbo. So when no priest could arrive in time, the midwife stepped in. This wasn't a small thing. The baptismal words had to be perfect. I baptize thee in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost. No stuttering. No improvising. And water, any water, had to touch the child's skin. Even the midwife's own tears, in a pinch, if that was all she had. Mainstream historical fact: many medieval midwives were required by church authorities to swear oaths that they would perform emergency baptisms when necessary, and that they would report any unbaptized deaths. Failure to do so could result in excommunication, fines, or worse. And your fringe tidbit? In some rare cases, women were buried with a small pot of holy water tucked into their grave clothes, just in case their babies needed baptizing in the afterlife. Was this an official rite? Not even close. But it was whispered, and the midwives knew it. The tension ran deeper. Some clerics distrusted midwives entirely, especially those who used charms, spells, or folk rituals in their practice. Too much influence, they'd say. Too many secrets. The midwife knew when a woman last bled, who the likely father was, whether a birth came early or late. She knew things confession didn't always reveal. And yet, churches often relied on her. She kept birth records. She verified paternity in inheritance disputes. She delivered babies destined for baptism and funeral alike. A priest might rail against her methods from the pulpit, but still nod at her in passing, still bless her herbs when asked. Because faith and function had to find common ground. Midwives themselves came in all stripes. Some were deeply devout, starting every labor with a prayer to Saint Margaret, patron of childbirth. Others were quietly skeptical, lighting candles more out of habit than belief. Still others blended Christian rites with older practices, whispering invocations to saints alongside chants from grandmothers long buried. One recorded case from 13th century Italy describes a midwife who carved tiny crosses into the bedpost of every woman she helped, believing it would protect both mother and child. In another, a midwife in rural France left an offering of bread and wine near a sacred spring before each difficult birth, just in case divine assistance was listening. Historians still debate how much the Church genuinely supported midwives versus simply tolerated them. Some bishops issued licenses to regulate their practice, insisting they be trained in Christian methods. Others ignored them completely unless something went wrong. And when things did go wrong, the Church could be brutal. A mother died? Did the midwife use holy oil? A child deformed? Did she speak the proper prayers? In extreme cases, midwives were accused of witchcraft, especially if they were old, unmarried, or simply too successful. Knowledge, in this context, became a liability. But most of the time, she walked the line. Carefully. Respectfully. She went to Mass. She blessed her hands before a birth. She taught her apprentices which saints to invoke, which days were unlucky for labor, which prayers calmed frightened mothers. And when she delivered a baby safely, she often whispered a blessing no one had taught her. Just something old and rhythmic, something that sounded like a hymn but wasn't in any book. Something passed down like a lullaby, soft and sacred. You watch her rise now from the chapel floor. Her knees creak. Her hands tremble just slightly. But her gaze is clear. She doesn't seek permission. She doesn't demand praise. She just leaves a coin in the offering box, more than she can spare, probably, and slips back into the night. She'll be called again soon. Another birth. Another soul needing welcome or passage. And she'll answer, as she always has, with a foot in both worlds. It's just before sunrise, and you're following a path between crooked rows of gravestones, their edges blurred by moss and the early morning mist. The village is still sleeping, save for one figure moving steadily between markers, the midwife. But today, she's not bringing life into the world. She's remembering those she couldn't save. Because for every joyful cry, there was silence. For every child wrapped warm and nursed at the breast, another was buried too soon. The midwife didn't just welcome life, she bore witness to its absence. And in the quiet moments between labors, she grieved. Death in childbirth wasn't rare. It was expected. A normal risk, like fire or famine. Mothers bled. Babies stopped breathing. Fevers took hold. And the midwife, despite her knowledge and skill, couldn't always stop it. Mainstream historical fact, in some parts of medieval Europe, maternal mortality rates were as high as 1 in 100 births, possibly higher when factoring in rural areas with no formal records. Infant mortality? Worse. Up to half of all children died before the age of 5. The midwife knew those odds. She faced them every day. She kept lists. Not on parchment, necessarily, but in her memory. The girl with the red hair who bled too fast. The noblewoman who convulsed for hours before falling still. The baby born blue, limp, and silent. She remembered every one. Not as failures, but as stories she carried, like stones in her apron. And here's your fringe detail. In some villages, midwives held informal mourning rituals for babies lost in childbirth. They would light a candle, pour a few drops of milk into the hearth, and whisper a name, if one had been chosen. These moments weren't recorded in any church liturgy. They were personal, intimate, sacred in a different way. But grief didn't make her bitter. It made her careful. Every labor was approached with quiet reverence. Not fear, exactly, but respect. Because she knew the thinness of the line. She walked it too often to be careless. When a woman died, the midwife didn't just leave. She stayed. She washed the body, closed the eyes, brushed the hair. She helped the family dress her for burial. Sometimes she wrapped a strip of cloth stained with blood, proof of the birth gone wrong, and tucked it into the coffin. Not out of superstition, but out of honor. This was her work too. Historians still argue about how much emotional support midwives received from their communities. Most likely, they didn't get much. There was no term for burnout. No space for grieving professionals. But the midwife had her own rituals, her own ways of surviving. She talked to the dead. Not loudly. Just whispers, while folding cloths or tending herbs. You fought hard. She loved you. I'm sorry. Words not meant for ears, but for the soul. Sometimes she cried. Not during the birth, never then. But later, alone, with hands still raw from scrubbing. She wept for the girl who bled out holding her hand, for the baby whose first breath never came. And then she wiped her face and went to the next house. Because grief was part of the job. Not an accident, not a burden. A constant companion. In a way, she became the village's living memory. The one who knew which families had lost children, which women had survived impossible births, which mothers still lit candles on certain days. She carried those stories so others wouldn't have to. One tale tells of a midwife in Bohemia who, upon her own death, was found with a small wooden box tucked under her bed. Inside, dozens of tiny scraps of cloth, each marked with a name. When asked, her apprentice said, those were the ones she couldn't save. No one had known. No one had asked. But she had remembered. You follow her now as she stops before a small marker near the edge of the cemetery. It's weathered and unnamed, just a stone tucked in the soil. She kneels, brushes away some leaves, and places a single dried flower, something she picked months ago, now faded to brittle brown. No prayers. No speech. Just presence. And then, she rises. The sun is breaking the horizon now, and another call will come soon. A knock at the door. A pain in the belly. A life beginning. But for this moment, she stands with the ones who didn't make it. And she honors them, not with rituals or relics, but with memory. The sun's high overhead now, and you're back in the center of the village, where children dart between carts and chickens and a woman calls out for someone to bring more firewood. Life, in all its noisy, messy, glorious persistence, fills the air. And walking calmly through it all is the midwife, older now, lines deepened, gait slower, but still unmistakably her. Because here's the thing no one tells you, the midwife doesn't just fade away. She evolves. With every birth, every whispered worry, every jar of herbs brewed in a smoky kitchen, she's been building something invisible but unshakable, authority. In a time when few women held official power, she did. Not political, not inherited. Earned. Through sleepless nights and quiet bravery. And now? She's the elder. The one others turn to, even outside the birthing room. You watch as a merchant pauses mid-haggle to ask her opinion on his daughter's fever. A priest nods to her with more warmth than formality. A group of girls giggle and then hush as she passes, whispering in awe. She's not feared. She's respected. And that's a rarer thing than you'd think. Mainstream historical fact, in some medieval communities, elder midwives served on informal councils of women, advising not just on births, but on disputes, moral dilemmas, even village decisions. Their voice wasn't always official, but it was trusted. Because everyone knew, if you'd watched people be born and die for 40 years, you probably knew a thing or two about life. And your quirky tidbit, in a few German villages, retired midwives were given symbolic items when they stopped practicing: a carved birthing stool, a silver spoon, a shawl embroidered with herbs. These weren't prizes. They were markers of honor. Public recognition of a life spent helping others begin theirs. She's not retired yet, though. Not quite. She still answers calls. But now she brings an apprentice. A young woman who watches, listens, carries the bag, and occasionally catches her breath when things go sideways. Just like she once did. And when her apprentice falters, the midwife leans close and says something that steadies the nerves. She knows what's needed. She always does. Historians still debate the structure of these informal apprenticeships. Were they mentorships or indentures? Were they empowering or exploitative? As usual, it depends. But one thing's clear, without formal schools or licenses, midwifery survived through human connection. Through the willingness of one woman to teach another. Not for profit. For legacy. Because that's what this is now, legacy. The older midwife doesn't just carry memories. She passes them. In herbs identified by smell alone. In chants remembered from her teacher's teacher. In the way she presses a belly, checks a pulse, waits through silence with unwavering calm. She doesn't talk much about her own births now. Not unless asked. But when she does, her voice softens. There was a boy once, born backwards and blue. I turned him just in time. Or, that woman, they said she wouldn't live, but she nursed her baby a week later. No boasting. Just stories. Like flint sparks. Small, bright truths struck from long memory. She knows, of course, that some people still mistrust her. Some call her superstitious. Others, outdated. Why does she still use nettle tea, they'll ask. Why not let the doctor handle it? But she shrugs. She knows what works. She knows what heals. And she knows something the doctor doesn't, the exact moment when a frightened mother needs a hand to hold. The rhythm of the village heartbeat. The way babies squint at the world with that same wrinkled frown, generation after generation. Medicine can measure. But she remembers. Now, she pauses at the well, greeting the baker's wife with a question about her third child's cough. She's not being nosy. She's being thorough. She's still working. Even if she never steps inside another birthing room, her presence continues to steady the village. Because this, more than anything, is what she's built, trust. In a world that changed constantly, where wars came and went, where kings rose and fell, where even the church sometimes stumbled, she was the constant. The one who showed up. So when the apprentice asks her, one afternoon, "Do you ever miss the old days?" she laughs. Not bitter. Not wistful. Just amused. "Child," she says, "these are the old days. Yours now." And then she walks on, the afternoon sun catching the edges of her shawl, and the scent of lavender and wood smoke trailing in her wake. The night is warm, the sky stretched wide above a village sleeping in uneven breaths, and you're inside a home that feels strangely familiar now. The fire is low, the walls shadowed, and the air carries that same comforting blend of herbs and old stories. The midwife is here, but this time, she isn't standing. She's sitting. Watching. Waiting. Her hands still, her bag set aside. Tonight, it's not her turn. Her apprentice is leading the birth. It's a quiet affair, just the laboring mother, her sister, the young midwife, and the older woman nearby, sipping tea and watching with a calm that only comes from knowing exactly how unpredictable life can be. She doesn't interfere. She's taught her pupil well. She knows the signs, the rhythms, the way the sweat beads on a brow just before the final push. Mainstream historical fact, by the late Middle Ages, many midwives began formally passing on their knowledge to chosen apprentices, sometimes even petitioning local lords or parish councils to grant them the right to practice in their stead. This wasn't a legal necessity, it was a practical one. Without someone to continue the work, the community would suffer. Tonight, the apprentice is nervous. You can see it in her shoulders, in the way she checks everything twice, breathes just a bit too fast. But she's doing fine. She's steady. She listens. She reassures. And when the baby finally arrives, squalling and slippery and perfect, she laughs, half in relief, half in wonder. The older midwife closes her eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over her. Another one safe. Another one begun. And now, your final quirky tidbit. In some villages, when an apprentice midwife successfully delivered her first child alone, the mother would gift her a token, often a ring, a scrap of ribbon, or even a piece of embroidered cloth. These tokens weren't just keepsakes. They were a midwife's secret resume, sewn into her shawl or hidden in her bag, marking every life she helped begin. The mother holds her newborn now, sobbing softly, overwhelmed and exhausted. The apprentice begins cleaning up. And the midwife rises, slow but sure, to leave the room. She doesn't need to be there for the rest. Her work is done. Not just tonight, but in a larger sense. The torch is passed. Historians still debate the scope of the midwife's legacy, how many lives saved, how much knowledge preserved, how often her hands steadied a world just barely holding together. But numbers miss the point. Because her true legacy lives in moments like this. In babies born safely. In women who felt strong. In quiet wisdom whispered in firelight. She steps outside into the cool night, breathes deep, and lets the silence wrap around her like a shawl. Somewhere nearby, an owl calls. A dog barks once. The stars burn on, old and indifferent. And she, too, endures. Because the role of the medieval midwife was never just about birth. It was about holding space for life, in all its mess and mystery and miracle. And long after her name is forgotten, her impact remains. She walks slowly home now, no longer in a rush, no longer needed every minute, but still part of the fabric of her world. And that, in the end, is the best kind of immortality. And now, as we reach the end of our journey, the world begins to soften. The torches flicker low in village windows, the forest has quieted to a whisper, and the last bell of the evening tolls faint and far away. You feel it, don't you? That exhale. That gentle slipping of time as night deepens. The midwife's story, for all its grit and candlelit realism, has always carried a thread of reassurance. That even in the darkest times, in cold cottages, during war, in moments of unspeakable grief, there was always someone who showed up. Quietly. Consistently. With hands prepared and a heart that held space for both beginnings and endings. And though we've wandered far, through birthing rooms and herb-laced forests, chapels and shadowy graveyards, it's comforting to remember that her legacy is not lost. It's stitched into modern medicine, echoing in every delivery room, every whispered reassurance from nurse to patient. Her presence endures, soft and steady. So wherever you are now, curled up beneath a blanket or listening in the still hush of your room, take one last breath with her. Feel the safety of hands that knew exactly what to do. Hear the fading sounds of another fire-banked hearth, of a cradle being rocked gently into slumber. And rest easy. Because even history has its caretakers. And tonight, you've traveled alongside one of the best.